For 10 years, nobody knew his name. Nobody knew his face. But thousands of people knew exactly what he was capable of because they had survived him, or they hadn't. He broke into over 100 homes. He committed at least 13 murders. He raped more than 50 women. And every single time, he disappeared without a trace, not a fingerprint. Not a reliable description, not a single lead that went anywhere. For decades, he was just a ghost with a badge number and a theory. But here's the thing that makes this case unlike almost any other in American history. He wasn't caught by a detective. He wasn't turned in by a neighbor. He was caught by a genealogy website, by a retired prosecutor working out of her spare bedroom, and by a DNA sample taken from a pizza crust. This is the story of the man who terrorized an entire state for a decade and the decades-long obsession it took to finally bring him down. Stay with me, because this story is far stranger and far darker than anything you've been told. California, 1976. The state is golden, warm, thriving. The suburbs are expanding. Families are moving into new neighborhoods in Sacramento, Fresno, Stockton houses with big backyards and unlocked sliding doors, and the quiet assumption that nothing bad could happen here. Not here. Not in a place like this. And for most people, nothing did. But somewhere in those neighborhoods, a man was watching. He walked the streets at night, slowly, deliberately. He studied the homes. He noted which dogs barked and which ones didn't. He watched which lights went off first. He memorized routines. He crept through backyards, silent as fog, and he left no trace that he was ever there, except sometimes, when he wanted to, he'd rearrange something, move a pair of shoes, unlock a window, leave a little signal just for himself, a small, private message that said, "I was here, and you didn't know." Nobody knew, not yet. But they were about to find out. Let's go back to where this story, at least the part we can trace, actually begins. August 1976, Rancho Cordova, California, a quiet suburb just east of Sacramento. A woman wakes up in the middle of the night to a flashlight beam in her face, a masked figure standing over her bed. A voice, calm, strange, almost controlled, whispering that she needs to stay quiet, that he won't hurt her, that he just wants food and money. She obeys. She's terrified. He assaults her. And then he leaves. Police are called. A report is filed. They're confused because this doesn't fit any known pattern. The entry point is strange. A window that had been unlocked from the outside at some earlier point. He knew the layout. He knew she lived alone. He knew. Then it happens again, a week later, 2 blocks away. Then again. By the end of 1976, there have been over a dozen attacks in Sacramento County alone. The man is striking with eerie precision, targeting neighborhoods he clearly knew, choosing victims he had clearly watched. He was always masked. He always used the same rope-tying technique, hands behind the back, a stack of dishes left on the victim's back, with the threat that if he heard them fall, he'd come back and kill everyone. He gave himself a name in his own mind, though the public wouldn't use it for decades: the East Area Rapist. At this point, nobody could have guessed that this man would go on to become the most prolific, unidentified serial criminal in American history. Nobody could have guessed that the hunting of him would consume careers, destroy investigators, and haunt survivors for over 40 years. And nobody could have guessed who he actually was. By 1977, the fear in Sacramento is real and palpable. Women are sleeping with guns. Neighborhood watch groups are forming. The local paper is running front-page coverage. The East Area Rapist has attacked dozens of women, and investigators are frustrated because for all the crime scenes, all the witnesses, all the evidence collected, they have almost nothing useful. What they do have is a profile. He's a white male, probably between 20 and 30 years old, medium height, athletic build, based on behavioral analysis, meticulous, organized, a ritualistic quality to his crimes. He lingers. He sometimes calls his victims before the attack, heavy breathing, hang-ups. He cases neighborhoods for weeks, maybe months, before striking. He's patient in a way that isn't normal. One profiler notes something that will haunt investigators for years. This man behaves like someone with training, like someone who knows how law enforcement works, like someone who has studied how crimes are solved and how to avoid that. One name keeps coming up in early investigations. A young officer, local, familiar with the area, had recently been fired from a small-town police department for shoplifting, caught stealing dog repellent and a hammer, items that struck some investigators as oddly purposeful. He'd been interviewed, he'd been looked at, and then he'd been released. His name was Joseph James D'Angelo, and he went home to his house, and he kept going to work, and he kept attacking. The thing is, nobody connected the dots yet, because in the 1970s, law enforcement agencies didn't share information the way they do now. Sacramento knew about the East Area Rapist. But what was happening 300 miles south in the Central Valley and Southern California, they didn't fully know about that yet. Not yet. 1978. Visalia, California. 2 years before the East Area Rapist becomes headline news in Sacramento, investigators in Visalia are dealing with a completely different criminal, or so they think. Someone they've been calling the Visalia ransacker, a burglar who broke into over 100 homes over several years, stealing small, almost random items, cash, jewelry, little things. Sometimes he'd move objects around. Sometimes he'd take underwear from women's drawers. He was never seen clearly, never caught. In December 1975, a journalism teacher named Claude Snelling woke up to find a masked man trying to abduct his teenage daughter. Snelling confronted the man. The ransacker shot him dead and fled. One investigator, a detective named Bill McGowan, nearly caught him. A foot chase, a shot, fired. The suspect escaped into the darkness, but not before McGowan saw the man's eyes. Calm. Utterly, disturbingly calm, even while running, even while being shot at. The Visalia ransacker was never conclusively linked to the East Area Rapist while those investigations were active. The distance, the different profile, the lack of shared databases. But investigators would later confirm the Visalia ransacker, the East Area Rapist, and someone they hadn't named yet were all the same man. He was escalating. Let's talk about what escalation actually means in this context, because this is important. The crimes in Visalia were break-ins, petty theft, one murder, a reactive one when he was nearly caught. The crimes in Sacramento were rapes, calculated, ritualistic, terrifying. But the victims were mostly left alive. In 1979, that changes. Brian and Katie Maggiore are walking their dog in a Sacramento neighborhood on the evening of the 2nd of February, 1978. They are young, They are happy. They've just gotten married. By all accounts, they encountered the East Area Rapist by chance, wrong neighborhood, wrong time, wrong place. He killed them both. Shot them dead in the street, dropped a piece of evidence, a unique crochet tie, and disappeared. This is the pivot. This is where the East Area Rapist stops being just a serial rapist and becomes something else. But the worst is still coming. And it's coming from the South. Southern California, 1,979. Orange County, Ventura County, Santa Barbara County. A new series of crimes is unfolding. But these aren't rapes. These are murders. Home invasions in the night. Couples targeted and killed. The victims are found tied up, bludgeoned, the signs of prolonged torture evident at the scenes. These attacks are different in style. From Sacramento, more violent, more lethal. But investigators notice certain details. The bindings, the method of entry, the profile of the offender. A couple named Robert Offerman and Deborah Manning killed in their condo in Goleta, December 1979. Lyman and Charlene Smith, killed in Ventura in March 1980. Keith and Patrice Harrington, killed in Dana Point in August 1980. Manuela Withhoon, killed alone in Irvine in February 1981. Sherry Domingo and Gregory Sanchez, killed in Goleta in July 1981. Janelle Cruz, the last known victim, killed in Irvine in May 1986. Investigators in Southern California call this man the original Night Stalker, not to be confused with Richard Ramirez, who was dubbed the Night Stalker by the press and whose crimes overlapped in the same region. The original Night Stalker was different, older methodology, more calculated, already practiced. For years, the East Area Rapist in Northern California and the original Night Stalker in Southern California are treated as two separate cases, two separate monsters. It isn't until 2001, through DNA comparison, that investigators confirm what some had suspected for years. They were the same person. The East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker, the Golden State Killer. One man, at least 13 murders, at least 50 rapes, at least 100 burglaries, and still no name. Here's what strikes investigators, survivors, and armchair detectives alike about this case: the sheer discipline times of this man. He operated for a decade, 1974 to 1986, and then he simply stopped. No arrest, no public breakdown, no suspicious death. He just stopped. Serial offenders almost never do that. Criminologists will tell you that the drive that compels someone to do what he did doesn't just switch off. It consumes. It escalates. It pushes toward a point where mistakes become inevitable, where someone finally gets caught. But not him. He stopped, and he had 32 more years of ordinary life. He drove to the grocery store. He mowed his lawn. He went to his doctor's appointments. He might have stood behind you in line somewhere and smiled and said nothing, and you never would have known. That's the part that makes people's skin crawl. That's the part that kept investigators awake at night. Where do you look for someone who looks exactly like everyone else? By the early 2000s, the Golden State Killer case had become something of a legend, tragic, unsolved, consuming. Detectives who had worked it for decades were retiring and handing off their files. New investigators were picking up the cold case, and a growing community of amateur sleuths and true crime researchers were becoming obsessed. One of them was a retired prosecutor from Sacramento named Paul Holes. Holes became fixated on the Golden State Killer case in the 1990s. He spent years on it, processing old DNA evidence, building timelines, theorizing about where the killer might have been during gaps in the crime spree. He believed the killer was still alive. He believed he was catchable. He spent the last years of his career hunting him. Another was a woman named Michelle McNamara. McNamara was a true crime writer and blogger, the wife of comedian Patton Oswalt, who dove headfirst into the Golden State Killer case and emerged changed by it. She interviewed survivors. She analyzed evidence. She corresponded with investigators. She was the one who coined the name the Golden State Killer in a 2013 article for Los Angeles Magazine, a name that stuck. She was writing a book about it. She called it "Times I'll Be Gone in the Dark Times," a phrase taken from something the killer once whispered to a victim, a chilling promise. A threat wrapped in the language of departure. Michelle McNamara died in her sleep in April 2016, an accidental drug overdose due to an undiagnosed heart condition combined with medication. She was 46 years old. She never got to see him caught. Her book was finished by her researchers and published posthumously in 2018. It became a bestseller. It reignited public attention on the case, just as investigators were closing in. Close enough to almost touch. Here's the thing about DNA. It has revolutionized criminal investigation in a way that few technologies ever have. But for decades, the Golden State Killer's DNA sat in evidence bags, occasionally reprocessed through CODIS, the National Criminal Database, and returned with no match every single time. No match, because his profile had never been entered. He had never been arrested after the crimes were committed. He'd gone quiet. He was invisible. But in 2017, a new technique emerged: forensic genealogy. The concept sounds almost mundane. Take a DNA sample from a crime scene, upload it to a public genealogy database, the kind people use to trace their family trees and find relatives who share enough DNA to suggest a biological connection. From there, build out a family tree. Identify candidates. Narrow the field. Find your suspect. It sounds simple. It was anything but. A genetic genealogist named Barbara Ray Venter was brought in to work the case quietly, almost covertly. Working from the Golden State Killer's DNA, preserved from crime scenes decades old, she began uploading it to GEDmatch, a public genealogy platform. She started finding distant relatives, second cousins, third cousins, people who had no idea they were connected to the most wanted unidentified serial killer in American history. She built trees, massive sprawling family trees, hundreds of names, thousands of branches. She and her team narrowed it down using age, location, physical description. They eliminated candidates one by one. And eventually, one branch of one tree kept pointing to the same place. A man in his 70s, living in Citrus Heights, California, a suburb of Sacramento. His name was Joseph James DeAngelo Jr. Joseph James DeAngelo was born on the 8th of November, 1945, in Bath, New York. He grew up in a military family, moving frequently. He served in the Navy during the Vietnam War era. He attended Sierra College and then California State University, Sacramento, where he earned a degree in criminal justice. He became a police officer, first in Exeter, California. Then, starting in 1976, the same year, the East Area Rapists' crimes began in Auburn, California. He was a cop, a real badge-carrying, gun-toting police officer, while he was raping and murdering people across the state of California. He was fired from the Auburn Police Department in 1979, caught shoplifting a can of dog repellent and a hammer from a drugstore. Investigators would later note those items with grim recognition. After his firing, he worked for a time as a truck mechanic. He married a woman named Sharon Huddle in 1973. They had 3 daughters together. They eventually divorced. He lived alone. Neighbors described him as odd, difficult, angry. He'd shout at people over minor issues. One neighbor said he once pointed a rifle at her dog. Another said he kept almost entirely to himself. But nothing more than that. Nothing that would make you think, monster. In the spring of 2018, investigators had a name. But a name isn't an arrest. They needed confirmation. They needed to connect D'Angelo's DNA, the actual genetic material from his body, to the DNA collected from those decades-old crime scenes. So they watched him. A team from the Sacramento County District Attorney's Office and the Sacramento Sheriff's Department set up covert surveillance. They followed him. They watched his routines, the grocery store, the pharmacy, the gas station. They waited for him to leave something behind, a cup, a tissue, anything with saliva or skin cells. On the 18th of April, 2018, they got it. D'Angelo discarded an item, an account of exactly what varies, but reports have indicated it was material from outside his home. A swab was taken. Processed. The DNA was compared to the Golden State Killer's profile. It was a match. 12 crime scenes, 1 genetic fingerprint, 1 man. Joseph James D'Angelo was the Golden State Killer. On the 24th of April, 2018, just after 8 a.m., D'Angelo stepped outside his home in Citrus Heights. He was met by a team of law enforcement officers, guns drawn, badges out. 4 decades of hunted history standing on his front lawn. He was taken without incident. No dramatic chase, no standoff, no final act of violence. He was just an old man, suddenly exposed in the morning light, 72 years old, slightly hunched, looking confused or at least performing confusion. He said very little. When investigators informed him of the charges, and there were many, he reportedly said, almost to himself, "I don't know how you caught me." The news spread instantly. The internet erupted. People who had spent years, some of them decades, obsessed with this case were hit with something they hadn't fully prepared for, an answer. Paul Holes, who had worked the case for years and had retired just days before the arrest, broke down crying. He hadn't expected to live to see this moment. Most investigators hadn't. Survivors received calls from victim advocates. Some wept. Some sat in silence. Some said they had never believed this day would come, that they had made peace with the idea of never getting a name. And now there was a name. Now there was a face, an address, a past, a family, a past, a family, a family. And so began the long, complicated, agonizing reckoning with what comes next. The legal process that followed was as complicated as you'd expect for a case spanning 12 counties, 13 murders, and 50-plus rapes committed across a decade. In an era before digital record-keeping, prosecutors from multiple jurisdictions had to coordinate. Evidence from the 1970s and 1980s had to be re-authenticated, reanalyzed, represented. D'Angelo sat in jail. He waived his right to a speedy trial multiple times. His attorneys argued he was elderly and in declining health. He appeared in court in a wheelchair on at least one occasion, a jarring visual contrast to the athletic, disciplined predator described in the crime reports. The families of victims and the survivors themselves watched. Some attended hearings. Some couldn't bring themselves to. Then, in June 2020, Joseph James D'Angelo entered a courtroom at Sacramento State University, a venue chosen for its space, to accommodate the number of victims and families who wished to attend, while observing COVID protocols, and he pled guilty. Guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder. Guilty to 13 counts of kidnapping. Guilty, through a plea deal that would avoid the death penalty, to all charges. In exchange, life in prison without the possibility of parole. Some survivors and family members felt relief. Some felt fury that he'd avoided execution. Some felt a complicated mix of both the bitter satisfaction of a confession weighed against the knowledge that death row might have meant decades more of appeals, delays, legal maneuvering. At least this way, there was finality. He would die in prison. Of that much, they could be certain. Before the sentence was formally delivered, the court held a victim impact statement phase. It lasted 2 days. What happened in that courtroom was, by any measure, extraordinary. Survivor after survivor stood before D'Angelo and spoke directly to him. Some were calm. Some wept. Some were furious, in a way that was almost structural, bone-deep, refined over decades. One woman who had been a teenager when he attacked her looked at him across the courtroom and said, simply, that she had spent 40 years waiting for this moment, and now that it was here, she wanted him to know. She had lived a full life. She had been loved. She had not let him take that. He sat in the wheelchair. He made almost no eye contact. At the end of the proceedings, the judge asked D'Angelo if he had anything to say. He did something unexpected. He stood up, he could stand, and he spoke, haltingly. He said he had listened to the victims. He said he was sorry. He spoke the name of each of his murder victims. Many in the room were unmoved. Some said later that the apology felt hollow, performative, the act of a man who understood the optics of remorse but couldn't truly access its meaning. He was sentenced to life in prison, multiple consecutive terms, no possibility of parole. He will die behind bars, probably alone. There are threads in this case that never fully resolve, no matter how satisfying the arrest might have been. There are victims who were never identified, women who survived attacks they never reported out of shame, fear, or the belief that nothing would come of it. There are cases in other jurisdictions that were never formally connected but bear all the hallmarks of D'Angelo's methodology. There may be crimes we simply don't know about yet. The Maggiore murders, that young couple killed while walking their dog in 1978, were only definitively linked to D'Angelo after his arrest. The Visalia ransacker crimes were confirmed as his. How far back does his history of violence actually go? Nobody knows for certain. There are also questions about what people missed. When he was fired from the Auburn Police Department in 1979, investigators had already begun to suspect a law enforcement connection to the East Area rapist. His name had come up. He had been looked at and cleared. If someone had pushed harder, looked longer, refused to accept the initial conclusion. But we can't know. Hindsight makes investigators out of all of us. In the moment, with the information they had, they made the calls they made. And he kept going. There's something about this case that burrows under the skin and stays there, even after the resolution, even after the guilty plea, even after the life sentence. It's not just the scale. It's not just the duration. It's the ordinariness. Joseph James DeAngelo wasn't a drifter. He wasn't living on the margins. He was a police officer. He had a family. He had neighbors who knew his name. He drove to work and came home and had dinner and watched television and existed inside the fabric of ordinary American life. And he was also, simultaneously, the most prolific unidentified serial criminal in American history. He passed polygraphs during early investigations. He answered questions at community meetings about the East Area rapist, possibly, horrifyingly, as a police officer, part of the apparatus supposedly hunting him. He looked people in the eye. And he was invisible. Michelle McNamara, in the pages of her unfinished book, addressed the Golden State Killer directly in her closing lines. She never knew his name when she wrote those words. She was writing to a ghost. "You'll be wearing an orange jumpsuit," she wrote, "and we'll know your face one day soon." She didn't live to see that day. But the day came. And in the end, it wasn't brute detective work that broke the case. It wasn't a tip. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't even technology in the traditional sense. It was a database of people tracing their grandparents' origins, civilians, curious about their heritage, voluntarily sharing their DNA, and one woman quietly building family trees in a room somewhere, following branches until they all pointed to the same address. It was genealogy. It was persistence. It was 40 years of survivors who refused to stop talking, investigators who refused to close the file, writers who refused to let the public forget. And it was a man who believed he had gotten away with it, who had lived for decades inside the comfortable certainty of his own invisibility. He was wrong. The Golden State Killer case changed American law enforcement. Forensic genealogy, once used quietly and somewhat controversially in this case, is now a legitimate and regulated investigative tool. DNA databases have helped solve dozens of cold cases since DeAngelo's arrest, some of them equally old, equally hopeless seeming. But it also opened new questions. Questions about privacy, about what it means that your distant cousin's DNA, uploaded to trace their family history, can now be used to identify you, about consent, about the boundaries of what law enforcement can access and how. These are questions without easy answers. They sit alongside the case like a shadow. Here's the last thing. There's a detail that investigators found when they searched DeAngelo's home after his arrest. In his house, among his belongings, they found something that stopped them cold. A draft, handwritten. It appeared to be a poem, something he had written, possibly years earlier, possibly recently. It was rambling, strange. It contained references to his victims, not by name, but in spirit. It was a document of a man who had been living in some interior compartment of his mind in the world of those crimes for his entire adult life. He never stopped thinking about what he had done. He just learned to carry it silently beneath the surface of a life that looked, from the outside, like nothing at all. The most terrifying monster in modern American criminal history wasn't hiding in the dark. He was standing in the checkout line. He was nodding at his neighbor. He was reading the newspaper about himself. And he was not afraid. Until the morning 4 officers stood on his lawn, and 40 years of silence ended, and there was nowhere left to hide. He's in a cell now. He'll die there. And in cities across California, there are women in their 60s and 70s and 80s who locked their doors a little differently the night they heard his name. Not because they were afraid anymore. Because, for the first time in a very long time, they weren't. If you've never read Michelle McNamara's Times I'll Be Gone in the Dark Times, read it. Not for the crime, for the writing. For what it means to chase something you may never catch, and to chase it anyway. And if this case affected you, if you're a survivor, if you knew someone who was the resources are real and they exist, you don't have to carry it alone. And that's all for today.